All right, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining today's On the Record briefing session, our first following our August break. We had planned to focus this briefing on this year's UN General Assembly and its renewed focus on the Middle East. And we will still get to that. But first, we have to address the breaking news. Just a few hours ago, Israel launched an attack targeting Hamas leadership in Doha. We'll begin with the latest development on that front, then return to our scheduled coverage for the rest of the session. So, to help us make sense of it all, we're joined by Ambassador David Hale, Career Ambassador and former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Ambassador Hale is also a Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow here at MEI. We're also joined by Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow at MEI, and the host of the podcast Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Nice mug, Brian. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We'll have a Q&A segment during the session, so if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function on Zoom, and if selected, we'll unmute you and you could direct your question to one or both of our panelists. And you could also type your questions in the Q&A chat box also here on Zoom. Let's get started. Ambassador Hale, we don't know much about the attack beyond the fact that the target was Hamas chief negotiator, Khalil al-Hayya. The success of the attack is still uncertain. However, we can assume that it will have far-reaching implications. What is your initial reaction, and what should we be watching for?
Well, clearly there's no absence of boldness on the part of the Israeli leadership in undertaking this attack. And I think it's a reflection of an unstated and still evolving national security strategy post-October 7, which the Israelis no longer feel that their security can be guaranteed if they're observing the taboos or norms that may have restrained some of their activities in the past. I think what we see in Syria, now today in Doha, and elsewhere is an unbridled Israel prepared to go preempt attacks and deal with their enemies wherever they may be found. That said, it's not novel. Ismail Haniyeh was nearly assassinated in the streets of Amman. An antidote had to be brought over at the insistence of then King Hussein. Khalid Mishal, that was Khalid Mishal's case. Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, Mabouh years ago in Doha. So this is not new, but you're right. It's going to be a dramatic event that will definitely strain Qatar's ability to continue to try to mediate between the Israelis and the Hamas movement.
Thank you, Ambassador. Brian, as Ambassador Hale just mentioned, it could restrict Qatar's role. Qatar is also home to Al Udeid Air Base. They've played a very important, prominent mediating role in the Israel-Hamas negotiations. What impact will this have on U.S. relations with the Gulf more broadly and with Qatar specifically?
Well, thanks, Zaina. It's interesting that this strike comes just months after Trump's visit to the Middle East that included a visit to Doha. And it's interesting also in June that Qatar was struck not by Israel, but by Iran in retaliation for strikes that the U.S. and Israel had conducted against Iran in the June 12-day war. At this moment, I think the Trump administration can toggle between many different things. Its agenda, as we saw in Trump's visit in May for the Middle East, was heavily grounded in an economic statecraft approach that was keen on building ties in tech and economics. But all of those things won't succeed without some modicum of stability across the region. And I suspect that this attack will definitely have an impact on the trajectory of the Israel-Hamas war, but it could potentially destabilize things or produce some uncertainty in the short run. In the longer run, the key question, I think, for U.S. policy is what is the diplomatic game plan, and how do these Israeli actions fit within what the Trump administration was trying to shape? I do a quarterly assessment of U.S. policy, as you know, Comes out every 3 months. I've been doing it since the Biden administration. And on the the Israel-Palestine file, it's the one where both the Trump administration and its predecessor got very low grades in my assessment. And I think this strike is an indication that a lot of what Trump was trying to do through diplomacy has not succeeded between Hamas and Israel, just as his attempts to end the war in Ukraine that Russia has been prosecuting for years have not succeeded. So that's, I think, some of the key questions is what's next? Is there even some sort of diplomatic pathway that can be reconstructed here? I'm skeptical given the nature of where things seem to be headed.
And we should mention also that this is the second time in recent months that Qatar comes under attack. The first strike was during the 12-day war with Iran. How vulnerable is the Gulf, Brian?
Well, look, I think for many years under successive U.S. administrations, when I go to the Gulf, I hear from Gulf leaders, they understand from essentially the, Obama administration and in the first Trump administration, they're a bit more on their own in terms of their own security. Now, I don't want to overstate that because I think America still has the deepest and broadest military footprint, and we seek cooperation under all of these administrations, and we work together, I think, quite successfully, as we saw in the 2 episodes in 2024 when Israel and Iran conducted strikes against each other. But messages have been sent about mixed messages from successive Democratic and Republican administrations that I think have prompted many of the Gulf states to seek to diversify their security relationships a bit. And I don't want to overstate that. I think America still is the strategic partner of choice. But things like the attack in 2019 against Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia and the lack of response from that, plus all of the mixed signals that I think successive U.S. administrations have sent, have pushed some of the Gulf states to look at how they can take care of their own security for themselves and also build partnerships in Asia, in other countries, in other parts of the world like Europe, and even including Russia, to secure their own security interests.
All right. Let's open the floor to questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box or use the raise hand function, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. We will now pivot and go back to our regular scheduled program. Ambassador Hale, as we know, several Western nations are intending to recognize the state of Palestine at this year's UN General Assembly. 2 of those states are members of the Security Council, France and Britain. What are the symbolic and practical implications of the recognition of Palestine, especially given that France and Britain are 2 of these countries?
Well, in my experience, whenever there's a period where it seems as if the United States is not actively leading an effort to bring peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, there's an instinctive effort on the part of other states or the Palestinians themselves to seek what they can't get in a negotiation in terms of recognition of a state. This goes back significantly to the first Obama term, when after George Mitchell's mission ended, Mahmoud Abbas pursued membership in UN specialized agencies, which we finally brought to a stop. In this case, it's, in my view, and I don't mean to be overly negative or cynical, but I think these Western European countries are addressing their own internal political constituencies that are frustrated by the lack of progress on behalf of the Palestinians as much as they're addressing anybody else. And I don't think that, again, experience shows that recognizing a state that in fact does not exist doesn't really move the ball forward. And, you know, it's even in the case of the British, it's ironic that they're not even asking for conditions to be met by the Palestinians in order to enable recognition. They're asking for steps from the Israelis, commitments by the Israelis to not do or do certain things, or else Britain will recognize a Palestinian state. So this entire process has become detached from the normal international legal sort of standards of you recognize a state when a state exists. You don't use it as a political weapon or cudgel against another state, which is what in fact is happening here. It's not going to change anything on the ground. Palestine will still be a Swiss cheese enterprise left where Oslo left it. And it's not going to change the equation in the UN. The Security Council is the only body that can recognize a state as a full member of the UN, and the United States will exercise its veto to prevent that. In many ways, it's a distraction from what is really needed but not happening, which is a serious effort to face up to what's going to be needed after the Gaza operations are over. What will be the political and diplomatic steps needed to sustain a more stable environment?
I think I know the answer to that question, but could it help end the war in Gaza, especially in light of the latest development that just took place?
I don't think it really has an effect one way or the other. I mean, you could argue that Hamas might feel slightly vindicated that violence actually has produced the thing that Mahmoud Abbas could not deliver, which is recognition by major European states of a Palestinian state. But again, this recognition is just on paper. So it doesn't really change the equation. And I don't think either Hamas or the Israelis showed much interest, frankly, in serial ceasefire proposals that have come their way.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Brian, now that the UK and France intend to formally recognize the state of Palestine, the United States will stand as the only permanent five-member state that has yet to do so. What will that mean for US foreign policy in the Middle East and for its influence in the region?
I think its influence remains strong, but it also, this move isolates it in absence of any other credible diplomatic plan that connects the attempts to end the war. As Ambassador Hale said, this initiative at the UN that we'll see is quite detached from a lot of things. It's detached from the reality of most Palestinians on the ground, especially those that are facing this new military campaign or renewed military campaign in Gaza City. Israel currently controls more than 75% of the territory in Gaza, and now there have been orders for people to leave Gaza City to get to an even smaller space. And all of these discussions seem terribly detached from that reality today. There's also a grim reality of noises about annexation of the West Bank, continued violence, as we saw yesterday with a terror attack against Israelis in northern Jerusalem. So all of these things, I think, add up to an absence of a credible diplomatic strategy on the part of the United States. And as we see about 8 months into the Trump administration, on its overall foreign policy, as I've written, he's in search of a major, credible, strategic foreign policy win. Yes, he's ended a few conflicts and had some important steps in different directions on things. His economic statecraft has not yet produced a big result, but particularly in the Middle East, there hasn't been a lasting, sustainable pathway carved on these fronts. And I think what will happen is it won't be America isolated, but I think countries will continue to move on without it, as we saw last week when China hosted 25 nations of the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, and President Trump was rage tweeting or on his social media platform against that. Again, I don't want to overstate it, but I think the more the U.S. is sort of isolated from all of these dynamics, the more incentives there might be for these countries in the region that want to see a clear pathway to a two-state solution, and they want leadership from other countries, particularly the United States, to step up. And right now, in my view, the Trump administration has largely been AWOL and has allowed Israel to continue its military campaigns to try to defend itself. It strikes without strategy in absence of a broader diplomatic framework.
Thank you. Ambassador Hale, I have a question from Russell Berman. If France or the UK recognizes a Palestinian state, what will the implication be for their consulates in Jerusalem, the notional capital of Palestine?
Right. Well, that's a very good point, because this is what we experienced when President Trump basically abolished our consulate in Jerusalem when the embassy moved there, which meant we sort of terminated our diplomatic relationship, such as it was with Ramallah, the Palestinians. When the Biden administration came in, one of their priorities was to try to reverse that as quickly as possible, and they couldn't, because Israel controls Jerusalem, and it controls the issuance of diplomatic visas to foreign diplomats to come into Israel, Jerusalem. So I don't think the status of the current consulates are going to change because they aren't closing them, but their ability to open up an embassy or a mission to Ramallah is entirely in the hands of the Israelis, and I'm quite confident the Israelis will not be particularly cooperative in that regard.
All right. Brian, the U.S. recently denied visas to Palestinian Authority leaders who had planned to attend this year's United Nations General Assembly. Could such a policy backfire on Washington and have the opposite effect?
I think it could. I mean, I'm still a bit puzzled as to why they would do this. I think it's in part just some sort of punitive measure related to what their expectations were on Palestinian Authority behavior, and then maybe connected to this diplomatic push. But I think the downgrading of diplomatic discussions with possible partners, especially those that aren't Hamas, ironically, the second Trump administration is the first U.S. administration to openly meet with Hamas leaders in negotiations. And this move to take what is already a very weak Palestinian Authority, and yes, it has corruption and political legitimacy problems, but to further try to isolate it seems to me that they're operating without a clear diplomatic map. I'm not clear what their end game is and what they seek as sort of an endpoint here. So I think, again, further downgrading ties, which have already been quite low and weak between the United States and Palestinians, I think is a bad move because it takes us further away from a potential solution. If I could say one other thing about Jerusalem, your earlier question to Ambassador Hale, I think one thing I'd watch is to see what other countries and entities, especially countries in the region, might do in reaction to whatever Israel might do to France and its consulate in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an important city, not just for Jews, but also Muslims and Christians. And there's growing concerns among people I talk with in Jerusalem about the Christian presence. And those concerns are shared by many in Europe. And then I think it'll be interesting to watch what Saudi Arabia does, because Saudi Arabia clearly the hopes that the Trump administration and others have for a potential Israel-Saudi normalization are very much linked to producing a clear pathway on the Palestinian front. And my point on this, going back to your earlier question, is you can't actually get there from here without actually working with some form of the Palestinian leadership that reflects the will of the Palestinian people that live still in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem.
On the question of how to get there from here, I have a question from Antoine Abisamra. Antoine is asking, do you see a great opportunity, perhaps the first real one since World War I, for the U.S. to shape a regional order? Do you see the U.S. leadership urgently needed to seize the opportunity, working with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey to shape a new regional order? Ambassador Hale?
Well, a new order is emerging on its own, in that the countries you just named are the major power players. You might add the UAE to the list. Riyadh is basically the de facto power capital of the Arab world. That's a transformation that I've seen in my lifetime. Israel clearly, in response to October 7, has demonstrated that its ability to extend its power and influence is far beyond what we thought before, and their willingness to do it. So all that's happening, and the Abraham Accords, of course, have taken the prospect of peace between Arab states and Israel to new heights and new levels that hopefully can be, as people sort of get past the immediate crises of the moment, look at how together they can face common strategic threats, both with diplomacy and military cooperation and integration, such as Iran. And of course, the counterflip of the new order is that Iran, which was calling the shots and setting the agenda and timetable for the Middle East for so many years, no longer, for at least for now, is able to do that. And so that's a complete reversal of fortunes. To make all this work, the logical sort of textbook approach for American diplomacy would be to accelerate this, to be active in knitting it together, to be throwing water on little brush fires that leap up, But we don't see that from this administration, which takes a very different view. I think that hopefully over time, the administration will realize that short-term itis, by that I mean looking at superficial solutions to immediate crises without trying to build deeper roots and longer-term solutions that are endurable, is not the way to go. That in fact, we need to stay present, persistent, but not overly ambitious either. We have to keep our understanding what's going to be possible in perspective.
Right. Brian, both US and Israeli officials have repeatedly criticized the recent recognition announcements. They called them a gift to Hamas. While you just mentioned, some Israeli officials are considering annexation of parts of the West Bank in response. Tensions in the West Bank is escalating. Just yesterday, we saw two gunmen from the West Bank opened fire at a bus stop in Jerusalem and killed 6 people. How do you see this situation unfolding?
I think we're looking at a very dangerous tinderbox in the West Bank, and we have for quite some time, and in parts of Jerusalem. And understandably, the focus has been on Gaza because of the hostages that are held there, the tens of thousands of people who have been killed, and many more who have been displaced and are being displaced as we speak right now, Zaina. And that's happening right now. But we can't distract ourselves from the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is there are these divisions within the Israeli government. Some of these voices boldly calling for annexation. Just last week, there was a pushback from that, as we saw from the United Arab Emirates, which is one of the Abraham Accord countries. So I think what we're seeing here are political actors, both within the Israeli system and then different actors in the region, different countries and non-state actors testing the limits of their power in the absence of that coherent strategy that I think Ambassador Hale was talking about, the traditional tools that people look to from the United States. They're just not present right now. And it's a big question to me whether and how much the United States is actually focused on a lot of these issues, the current Trump administration, relative to the other agendas that it has on immigration here at home, and also the questions of tariffs and trade wars in China. Those are bigger picture questions right now. And there's a bit of a home alone problem, I think, practically in parts of the State Department and the US government in terms of the personnel that used to be working on these issues day in and day out. So we're at a very dangerous moment. And I think, as both Ambassador Hale and I have said, the actors on the ground, those in the region, are the ones that are mostly shaping events. That doesn't mean that the United States is unimportant. It just means that we're distracted. We're, in my view, unilaterally disarming ourselves of many of the tools that we've used in the past to try to shape conditions. So it presents itself a very dangerous scenario, and one that I think has led the Israeli people themselves to come out into the streets in protests on a regular basis over the Gaza war, and then deep divisions within the society about these questions of annexation, as we saw spilled out over the last week or so. So we're at a moment of uncertainty, and that comes at a time when the world is going to meet at the UN General Assembly, and we're going to talk about that. But the disconnect between sort of the speeches and what we'll hear in New York and what's actually happening on the ground there, it's not uncommon, but it's particularly acute in terms of the situation on the ground.
I do want to stay with you for a second, Brian. I want to talk a little more about the UAE's comments and them saying that annexation is a red line that would end regional integration.
Mhm.
What does that exactly mean? Could we see the UAE altering its policies towards the Abraham Accords?
I doubt it. I think the Abraham Accords were struck in part as a consequence of tectonic shifts that had moved over the years. It wasn't some magic moment. These were relationships that were actually beneath the surface and then came out in 2020. And I think it was a crowning diplomatic achievement of the first Trump administration to bring not only the UAE, Bahrain and Morocco together in normalized relations. What I saw, the statement by Lana Nusseibeh, and I think it's not the last time I think we've heard from Emirati officials, is to actually exercise in a deft way their own leverage that they might have over not only the conditions in the region, but importantly, the discussion that Israelis have with themselves, the debate that they're having in their society. And this choice that I think has been clouded by the war, and understandably so. The hostages, the trauma from the war, the ongoing sort of conflict that comes from multiple directions, the attacks just last week from the Houthis in Yemen. Israel itself is not secure. And I think there's a big debate inside that society about the current leadership, especially Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was at the helm during the October 7th attacks and still has not yet produced a sustainable security environment for Israelis themselves. So I suspect it's not the last time we'll hear from the Emiratis. I think the thing that's missing is that concrete initiatives, going back to something Ambassador Hale said earlier about this two-state push, the symbolic recognition. I actually think it needs to be concretized into much more of a clear, pragmatic coalition that produces incentives for the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians to govern themselves in a way that responds to their own people. And also, what's missing is security guarantees going in all different directions. I think Israel conducts these military operations because it feels insecure and these issues are unresolved. But they won't be resolved until there's a clear answer to the question of how does this war end, especially in Gaza? And I've not heard that yet. And what's missing in the absence of U.S. leadership here is a clear, practical, pragmatic pathway to answer that question of how does this war end and what does it produce?
Ambassador Hale, the combination of this latest surge in diplomatic recognition, in addition to the UAE's comments, does that worry you at all, or do you have any concerns about the future of the Cold Peace, say between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, and other Abraham Accords, other countries, the reaction of other countries signatories to the Abraham Accords?
Yeah. Well, we've all seen chapters when the strains on the Israeli-Egyptian and Israeli-Jordanian treaties seemed unbearable, and yet they survived because leaders on both sides understood what was at stake and what a rupture in those relationships would mean for their mutual security and how difficult it would be to rebuild what had been achieved through Camp David and later the Jordanian Treaty. I will say, coming back to the annexation point, I agree 100% with Brian that particularly with the Emirates, Abraham Accords is born of a strategic congruence of interests. But it became public because of one thing, and that was Netanyahu's threat then in 2020 to annex the West Bank. And Yusuf Otaiba, the UAE ambassador, a very influential figure, wrote an op-ed making direct linkage between the prospect of normalization only if annexation was suspended for 5 years. So technically 5 years have passed, but I still think that for the Emiratis, for that deal to basically be violated would be a tremendous blow to their pride, to their strategy, and to the health of the Abraham Accords. I think it would survive, but it would be a very challenging point. I also think, this annexation talk is a reflection of divisions within the coalition that governs Israel. And if you look at the practicalities of it, there may be voices in Israel, if this annexation movement really gets going, that says, well, wait a minute, if we annex just a certain percentage of the West Bank, aren't we abandoning our claims to other parts of the West Bank? So I think they could get caught up in some of the technicalities of actually realizing this ambition of theirs. So I think, frankly, we will get past this crisis. I don't think annexation's likely to happen, but even if it does, I think there'll be an effort to move forward. The underlying problem, though, and I think this is being reinforced by both Brian and myself, but I want to say so again, is that the recognition campaign in Europe today is both a response and a reflection of the irrelevance of European diplomacy to this problem set. And I don't mean that in a mean way, but the Europeans simply are not regarded as even-handed by the Israelis. They don't have the influence to actually move mountains like the United States does. And even when we are relatively passive, as we are now at these moments, it is still all eyes on the United States. What are we going to do in any given crisis? And then only after that assessment is done, do countries begin to evaluate how to array themselves.
All right. I do have a question from the audience to Ambassador Hale. How important is ending the war in Gaza towards advancing Israeli peace with Syria and Lebanon?
Well, I think they're separate. Obviously, ongoing conflict in Gaza unsettles the neighboring states. There are strong, particularly among Sunni Muslim Arabs in Lebanon and in Syria, strong reactions to what they're seeing, even if they're not pro-Hamas. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is one that causes a great deal of distress and makes it harder to advance relations between Israel and those countries. There is an opening in Lebanon because of the near annihilation of Hezbollah. They're down, not completely out, but they are no longer the power player that they were. And the Lebanese government is taking steps. We'll see how meaningful they are to fulfill the terms of the ceasefire and disarmament. The Israelis will continue to hammer Hezbollah if they don't see the Lebanese army doing the job it has to do. But we now have a timetable provided by the UN on the departure of UNIFIL that gives ample room for the LAF, the Lebanese army, to build up its resources so that it can take on the sovereign duty of a state in protecting its area. I do not see a prospect of an Israeli-Syrian peace. I do not believe that, and I know we want to get into Syria later, but that Israel has any confidence in Shara as a partner. I think when they look at him, they see his past, not a future, and they're going to take their own security measures in their own hands. Whether that's good or not for American policy in Syria, we can debate, but it is a reality, and they have partners among the Druze in the south who are quite willing to cooperate.
Right. Brian, while we're still on the recognition question, what are Israel's options? Does it need to respond to such high-profile recognitions? We have seen reports about potential annexation. What would that look like? We have seen reports about potential closing of consulates in Jerusalem. What should Israel respond first, and what should that look like?
Look, Israel is a democracy, and it has to reflect in some ways the voice of its own people. Though this current government, I think, as we see in the protests in the streets about the Gaza war and other aspects, even before October 7th, about the handling of its own democratic system. Um, for every action, there's a reaction, and I think it'll provoke a reaction. The question is whether what Israel does, if this moves forward, a symbolic recognition, if they overplay its hand in a sense and overreach and produce some sort of outcome that actually is not good for Israel's long-term security interests. And it's, I think, the important pathway, the gold star, or excuse me, the North Star, should be Israel's sort of continued pathway into integration with the region. It's something that the current prime minister has said at different times he wants. It's a key point that President Trump, when he dreams of a Nobel Prize, he often thinks of getting that normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But that's not going to happen without some credible pathway to a two-state solution, which is something that is anathema to much of the current Israeli cabinet and the current Israeli government. So whatever tactical moves that are made in the short run in reaction to this push for symbolic recognition, if you're in Israel, you would hope that it doesn't produce any negative blowback that takes Israel further away from the bigger prize, the North Star, which should be regional integration and then broader connectivity with the rest of the world. These bigger visions that were expressed at the G20 in September of 2023, excuse me, of an India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. None of these visions are likely to be achieved without some credible resolution to all of these conflicts, which will take a long time. Again, back to Trump's visit, his only visit so far in his second term to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, the Spring Bling Tour, where there's broad hopes for economic prosperity across the region, and I share in those. But none of those will be achieved unless the diplomatic spade work, the legwork is done to actually produce that pathway. And I think however Israel reacts, I think it would be advisable that it doesn't overplay its hand and produce even more blowback against its own aspirations for broader integration in the region.
All right. Let me stay with you, Brian, for a second. On the Syria question,
Sure.
Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara is set to address the United Nations General Assembly in the coming weeks, and this will be the first time since 1967 that a Syrian president has spoken at the assembly. How significant is this, particularly in light of his background that we just talked about?
Yes, I mean, and Ambassador Hale highlighted some of the skepticism from Israel, and there was some even within the Trump administration. And I think probably the biggest surprise move that I've seen in the first 8 months of the Trump administration thus far was what he said and did in Saudi Arabia. He said he was going to lift sanctions on Syria, and then he met with Ahmed al-Shara, the de facto leader of Syria. And this comes after, during the transition period when al-Shara came to power and Assad was thrown out of power. The initial response by the Trump team and J.D. Vance was we should, quote unquote, stay the hell out, right? And all of this, I think, is yet another step towards Syria's reintegration with not only the rest of the region, but the world. The fact that its leader, de facto leader, will be addressing the UN, I think, is an important symbolic moment. The important thing to watch here is what's going on inside of Syria. And we've had several colleagues go there, including we just saw him today, and we're glad he's back safe and sound, Charles Lister. And he'll have a lot more to say about his visit. And MEI will be doing a lot more, as we all know, on the Syria question in the month of September. But the key sort of fundamentals are the basics. Is there security and control of the security situation by the government? And is it being done in a way that's inclusive and respectful of all of the groups that live inside of Syria that represent its mosaic? That's fundamental, number one. And then number two, which is equally pressing, is the economic situation. It's a country that's been devastated by not just a vicious civil war that pushed millions out of the country and killed hundreds of thousands, but decades of mismanagement and corruption. And as we see, many of the Gulf states have stepped in helpfully to try to produce a new framework for Syria standing on its own. This, to me, is early in the second Trump administration, next to Lebanon, next door, two of the lowest hanging fruits, complicated fruits, because there's so much to actually do to make sure that Syria hangs together and is respectful of all of its people and responds to the needs of its own people. But back to this speech, I think it's an important opportunity for Ahmed al-Shara to see if he's actually fundamentally shifted his approach from where he started to where he is, and then importantly send the right messages to the world, but to the people of Syria, that he's going to rule inclusively and do it in such a way that doesn't see Syria sort of backslide from what I think has been a very hopeful number of months here.
All right. Ambassador Hale, we have a question from Dawood Kutab. Dawood wants to know, how do we reconcile the presence of Ahmed al-Shara in New York's UN, while the most moderate and peaceful Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, is denied a visa?
Well, there's a tension in the United States system between our obvious right as a sovereign state to control our borders and issue or deny visas to whoever we want. But the tension is with our treaty agreement, a relationship with the UN, in which we have undertaken an obligation to issue visas to delegations attending UN events. And this tension pops up now and then. It used to be over the Iranians. Ironically, also, as you point out about Shara, the Iranian president, as I understand it, will also be coming to UNGA this year. And even Fidel Castro, we used to tolerate him coming at the height of our crises. So, I share Brian's sort of head scratching as to why this course was taken. Diplomacy is about communication. And even if you don't think much about Mahmoud Abbas's ability to influence the situation, it doesn't seem connected to a strategy. I think the more interesting thing, obviously, is Shara. And, I was a young note taker. I was assigned to our mission to the UN a long time ago. And there's nothing more mind-numbingly dull than having to take notes during these speeches in the General Assembly from one head of state to another, who stand up and pronounce, homilies and, things that you expect. And then they go home and no one ever remembers any of it. And you write up your notes and wonder why anyone might read it, and they probably don't. The Shara speech will be different, but it will be predictable in that he's going to say the things that he's been saying to international audiences, visiting diplomats and leaders wherever he goes, which is he's very smart and he knows how to address those groups and try to reassure them that he has changed. He is now a head of state and government. He understands the need for all the things that Brian mentioned in terms of trying to build a consensus and rule in a balanced fashion in Syria. But we don't need those words anymore. Well, we need to see the actual action that this is going to be delivered. So we're not going to see that at UNGA. What we're going to see is when he goes home, what's he doing? And it's a very different picture. And the way he handled the South and the Druze, the fact that basically he's ruling the pockets of Syria that he controls, the Muslim cities from the north, southern to all the way down to Damascus, the same way he ruled Aleppo. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see a lot of inclusiveness in the appointments in the government. And above all, I don't see action. The moment of truth will be, what is he going to do about extremist foreign fighters and extremists within his own ranks that brought him to power? And if he doesn't move smartly against them in a way that's not just symbolic, but real, despite the fact that they're his power base, all of this stuff is, I think, very hard to believe until those concrete actions are taken.
He does have one of his ministers, the only woman in government,
Yes.
happens to be a Christian. I think he has another Alawite minister, but I'm not
Yeah.
100% sure. But you're absolutely right. We've also seen we've seen many massacres happen to the Alawites in the coastal towns. We've seen it happen. We've seen explosions in a church at a church, and obviously the fighting that took place in southern Syria. So things are absolutely not okay in Syria security.
Yeah. And I misspoke. I meant to say he's ruling in the areas he controls, like the way he ruled in Idlib. I said Aleppo in error.
Another question for you, Ambassador Hale. Is there a plausible model for a Palestinian state that is significantly less than 1967 borders and therefore potentially acceptable to enough Israelis? Something like primarily Area A from Oslo?
Yeah, I mean, there have been lots of different conceptions since Madrid and Oslo on what territory would look like, and most of them, the ones that were more plausible anyway, did entail significant swaps to account for the settlements built around Jerusalem, which is something the Israelis will never give up. Also, to try to give territorial contiguity to the Palestinians, swaps that involve some lands that are basically like national parks and no one really lives there in areas of the West Bank. So, and vice versa. So there are lots of creative models you can use. The problem is not an absence of creativity on how you draw a map. It's an absence of political will. And after October 7, it's just very hard for me to see how you develop the kind of confidence and trust among the Israeli public and leadership to give them the sense that they can trade some measure of security in return for peace and trust. Who are they going to negotiate with? Who's going to be leading the Palestinians? October 7 unfortunately validated many of the worst assumptions of Israelis. And similarly, on the Palestinian side, opinion polling shows about half of the population supports a two-state solution. Not exactly a robust element there either.
All right. Brian, anything to add on the Israeli-Palestinian question and the recognition before we move on to Iran?
No, and I'm happy. I'd love to say a few things about the United Nations General Assembly when we get to that too, if we keep time for that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just very quickly, Ambassador Hale, Iran's sanctions and the snapback process, France, Britain, and Germany want to potentially reimpose UN sanctions. What can we expect on that front, and particularly during this year's UNGA?
Yeah, so the Europeans moved finally to recognize that that Iran is not in accordance with the international standards or with the basic JCPOA agreement, and have undertaken the snapback, which means they can reimpose sanctions without another vote in the Security Council, so no one can veto it. They're clearly trying to do this by the end of this month. The Russians are in charge of the presidency of the Security Council in October, so I think there's a nervousness, which when the deadline for the expiration of the snapback provision occurs in October, so they're trying to get it done before the Russian presidency. I understand just from reading the newspapers that the Russians may be proposing a 6-month extension of that deadline so that the Europeans don't feel like they have to sort of stampede into snapback. I'm not conversant with the European thinking, but on the merits, it's obviously warranted, and it will add to the maximum pressure strategy that I think we need on Iran. We've built up to, in this conversation today, to coming to Iran, but in some ways, it's important even at the beginning to recognize that an American policy that is going to try to develop this new world order, as one of the questioners said, or try to maximize the reversal of fortunes of Iran. It's all about Iran. We're not going to get what we want in Lebanon unless we have maximum, in my opinion, maximum pressure on Iran. And you can go through the whole list of problems in the region. So it's not a matter of just bombing their nuclear facilities and walking away. We have to build and maintain a coalition that really squeezes the Iranians so that they and their proxies see there's no option but diplomatic cooperation.
So,
If if I could say just on Iran, and I'm glad, Zaina, to see you drinking. You're taking the edge off the Middle East coffee cup there. Everybody should get one. We have a terrific episode dropping today of that podcast with our colleague Ross Harrison and Mohsen Milani on their new books on Iran. And it's just great food for thought that for people who want to look at sort of the bigger picture and not just these short-term questions, which are urgent and strategic, the snap-back questions, the questions of whether there's a pathway towards diplomatic resolution to this, but sort of the broader context for that. And I do agree with what Ambassador Hale said, is that Iran in many ways is the big still overriding strategic threat and challenge to the region, notwithstanding the 12-day war in June and the extensive damage done to its nuclear program. We still don't have a full damage assessment of what was done there. I don't see yet much of a clear diplomatic pathway to discuss these issues. And I have low expectations about how much this UN General Assembly and the discussions, which often center on Iran, will actually have the focus to look at this pressing problem, not just for the region, but for the world.
Absolutely. Brian, I do have a question for you from Dr. Zahir Sahlul. He wants to ask, do you believe al-Shara? He said that he has evolved. The majority of Syrians believe that he's trying to pull a balancing act where he's trying to control the extremist while moving to the middle.
Well, actions speak louder than words. And Ambassador Hale just said this a few minutes ago, and I'll just repeat it, is that it seems like he's evolved in many ways as a leader. I've not met the guy. I can't do my own assessment thoroughly in the way that people who have, I think, met him. I do think it's encouraging that a framework has been built, and the U.S. is part of it, to actually create incentives for not only him, but people in his government, right? We focus on leaders, and leadership is important, but helping the whole system reform itself in a way that actually responds to the diverse communities in Syria, that's a years-long challenge. It's not going to be just something that's determined on this visit. So main point, though, is actions speak louder than words.
All right, Ambassador Hale, how relevant is the current UN structure, which reflects the post-World War II international order, amid the erosion or dissolution of that order today? And how significant is this year's UN General Assembly?
Well, the United States has had a long-running love-hate relationship with the UN, in that we love it when it performs things that we want it to perform, and we hate it when it fails to meet the challenges, or even does things that we oppose. The UN is no stronger than what it is that the member states themselves of the UN can accomplish. And for a long period of time, the Security Council, the Cold War period, the Security Council was paralyzed by the contest between the United States and Russia. There was a golden period after the fall of the Soviet Union, where we were able actually to work very effectively in the UN on a number of priority security issues, Middle East peace, the Balkan conflict, other things like that. That window shut with the rise of President Putin, and also Chinese diplomacy has moved from a very passive approach to a much more aggressive approach at the UN and other bodies. So, the idea that the UN Security Council can be some great debate center to hammer out ideas is a little bit of a misunderstanding. It's a place where when there's a consensus or near consensus, we can actually come up with solutions. But that's a reflection of power and contests outside the Security Council that are brought into the Security Council. Now, there's been also the growth of all these specialized agencies, which are definitely a mixed bag. And I think this has been the onus, the focus of the Trump administration in particular in its latest budget proposals, to really try to trim back some of the spending of particularly voluntary assessments, which we are not obliged by law to make, to specialized agencies, which many people in our country, or at least those who are aligned with Trump, believe have lost their way.
Brian, where do we stand on that question?
Well, look, on the question of the United Nations, if I can make a broader point of this UN General Assembly, it comes at a very, I think, curious and I think unique moment in US foreign policy. And the second Trump administration is operating with a template that I read as much different from his first term in office. And uh, just to the UN, first and foremost, he came in his early days cutting all sorts of funding and relationships to key UN bodies. And some of this actually, I think, were important signals about the need for reform. Some of it may actually gut and cut some structures that have been there that do a lot of good. So there's a fundamental question of Trump's very transactional diplomacy, one that actually looks for quick wins, that is reliant on the use of America's economic leverage in his statecraft. How much we'll see in terms of what Trump and his team do and say during that week, and how it connects with this whole international infrastructure that's been there for decades, that for certain needs reform, but it does actually produce some benefit. So key questions is going back to the question of Gaza. Understandably, there are concerns about UNRWA and the concerns that Israel has had about it, but the questions left unanswered still in the face of hunger growing in Gaza, that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that was established by the Trump administration simply has been inadequate. So what is its overall approach, the Trump administration, going to be towards the United Nations, not just in these meetings this month, but then in a longer term? And if there are gaps that are created by pulling back from trying to work with different institutions of the UN, how do we fill those? Who will fill those? And I think the second thing I'll be watching with this UN General Assembly, not only in the Middle East, but on his overall foreign policy, is what Trump says. We have sort of an improv performer in chief par excellence as president of the United States. He seizes the media attention and gets everybody talking about what he says and does, and it's often quite provocative. But oftentimes also the gap between the rhetoric and what's actually produced, as we see in the efforts to end Russia's war against the Ukraine, is quite considerable. So I will be looking to see how he uses this as a media message point, as we saw in 2018 when Trump tried to take credit and brag about some of his accomplishments. He was literally laughed at in the UN General Assembly by much of the world. And I hate to bring that up, but in the last few weeks, Trump has been talking about his accomplishments in ending wars in Armenia and Azerbaijan, conflicts in Africa and other places. And the proof really will be in what the U.S. actually can produce in terms of results. And the gap, I think, between where, especially the situation on the ground is in the Middle East, and the discussions we're likely to hear from leaders, not just Trump, but others, I think it's going to be quite considerable this year.
All right. I do want to talk a little more about the budget, the UN's budget. Ambassador Hale, the US is the United Nations' largest donor. Recent cuts to foreign aid have left the UN feeling the impact. So, in light of these reductions, important questions arise. How can the institution sustain itself? And has it simply grown too large to manage effectively?
I think it's important to sort of separate the different activities of the UN. There's the core function of the Security Council in terms of trying to contribute to peace and security around the world. And that often ends up being manifested in the form of a peacekeeping operation if there's actually consensus in the council. They're not cheap, but they have a patchy history, of course, of actually producing what's hoped for from the UN. And I think that part of this cut includes money for UNIFIL, which has not had the mission. It's not their fault, but they don't have the mission to try to stop aggression from either side in South Lebanon, and from the UN operation in the Congo, which has been plagued by a lot of allegations of sexual abuse, corruption, and other problems. But then, so that's the peacekeeping side, which is really the absolute core of the UN when it was formed in 1945. But then you have the growth of these specialized agencies, which often pursue agendas that sound like they're well-meaning and universal in their values. But when you look at what they actually do, it's not much on the ground, and or it's not necessarily conducted in a way that the United States appreciates. So a lot of these cuts that we've been talking about are to the specialized agencies, UNRWA, World Health Organization, which unfortunately appeared to take the side of the Chinese and obscure the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. These kinds of things are, I think, the red meat that the Trump administration is looking at. And I don't think very many Americans, frankly, are going to stand up and defend, UNDP or UNEP organizations that don't really deliver on their goods. They are more designed to provide forum for anti-Americanism, and there's a huge amount of overhead in terms of their spending. UNRWA, of course, we've cut anyway already. I don't know that there's anything more to cut, but again, it's had this political problem of the fact that there were infiltrations by Hamas into their workforce, despite assurances to the contrary. And until UNRWA can really stand up and clean up its act and show that it has taken proactive measures, it's going to be very hard to restore UNRWA funding, vital as it is, because someone has to educate and provide health care to the Palestinian population. They're not just going away, and UNRWA has done that for decades.
Right. As we mentioned at the top of this briefing, there was breaking news before we started it, and that news is developing. I don't have a confirmation, but I have a question from the audience. What does it tell you that the U.S. knew about the Israel strike on Doha, perhaps even approved them? And apparently that has been reported by AP and BBC, according to our audience member. So can we try to answer, Ambassador Hale?
I simply don't know, and I think it would be reckless of me to speculate. I do know from my past experience that generally presidents and Israeli prime ministers talk a lot. There's a general understanding of what the United States can tolerate and what our red lines are. And it doesn't mean that the Israeli leaders always come back to the United States for a green light or a yellow light or a red light, particularly because they don't want to get a red light. But I just don't know in this instance what's happened.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I'm one of those cautious think tankers, as you know, Zaina, who is loath to speculate based on breaking news I've just heard. And I'd like to talk to folks. But the broader analytic point I'd make, and it's one I've made in these reports that I do on the Trump administration and as well as the Biden administration, is that this whole file, the attempt to try to actually get to a ceasefire, is tremendously difficult because you have two parties, Israel and Hamas, that essentially do not recognize each other's existence and want to obliterate each other. But then B, we've lacked sort of a clear strategy, which I actually think needs to go through many of our partners in the region, and a deeper strategy, not one that is symbolic in terms of a recognition of a state of Palestine, but one that actually lifts up the concerns and acknowledges the plight of the Palestinian people, not pushes them to the sidelines, but essentially says they're a key ingredient for peace and stability for Israelis, for people in the broader region. And sadly, I don't think we've had from this current administration or the one before it a really proactive strategy. We've had reactive tactical moves and a focus on the kinetics, which can be important in shaping the opportunities for diplomacy. It's not one versus the other. The question to me, though, is now after what's been done is done, what will be done to actually lift up the Palestinian side of the equation, especially those Palestinian people and the pragmatists who actually don't like Hamas. And we're with this, at least this administration is moving in the opposite direction, not allowing visas for any Palestinians and not having discussions there. And that to me doesn't add up in terms of a math equation that makes sense.
Absolutely. We've reached the end of today's webinar. Thank you to the audience for attending and for the great question, and a huge thank you to our speakers, Ambassador David Hale and Brian Katulis, for their time and valuable insights. We hope you found today's session informative and engaging. Thank you again and have a wonderful day. See you next time.